A roof in Manhattan, 12 stories above the street, 6:15 in the morning on a typical October day in the late 2000s. Picture a man on that roof. He is real. His name is Andrew Rosenwach, the great-grandson of Harris Rosenwach, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who arrived in New York in 1881. The work he is doing on this roof is the work he and his crews do by published industry estimate 90 times a year, though the specific tank described here is a composite reconstructed from the patterns in his firm's inspection records. He unscrews the hatch on the top of a wooden tank. The tank is 12 feet tall and 12 feet wide. It holds 8,000 gallons of water. On a typical Manhattan high-rise, this tank has been on the roof for 50 or 60 years. It has supplied drinking water and fire sprinkler pressure to every apartment above the 6th floor of the building. It has been cleaned on a schedule that the building's owners can document on paper, fewer times than the law requires. The Rosenwach Tank Company is one of 3 small family firms that build, install, and maintain the wooden water tanks of New York. The other 2 are Essex Brothers in Maspeth, Queens, and American Pipe and Tank in Long Island City. The companies are real, the labor is real, the $450 typical cleaning fee is real. The 2014 New York Times investigation that documented contamination in 5 of 12 sampled tanks is real. The reporter on that story was named Andrew Rice. We will return to it. He kneels at the open hatch and looks down into the tank. The interior is dark. Light from the morning sky falls through the hatch and catches the surface of the water. The water is clear at the top. He has a flashlight strapped to his forehead. He clicks it on, and the beam reaches the bottom of the tank. And what he sees on the wood floor of the tank, beneath 8,000 gallons of drinking water, is sediment. Soft, dark, and roughly 2 inches deep across the entire bottom of the cylinder. There are bird feathers in it. There is a thin film of algae on the lower interior walls. He has been doing this work long enough that he is not surprised. He documents what he sees on a clipboard and writes a recommendation for the building's owners. The recommendation is the same one his crews write about 90 times a year. The tank needs to be drained, scrubbed by hand, disinfected, and refilled. It will take a crew of 3 men about 6 hours. It will cost the building approximately $450. Whether the building's owners actually pay for the cleaning is not Andrew Rosenwach's decision. By that night, the tenants in the apartments below the tank he has just inspected have all turned on their showers, drunk water from their taps, and washed dishes in their sinks. And not one of them has thought about the wooden barrel sitting on the roof above them. This is a story about a barrel. The barrel above your apartment is not a metaphor. It is a real piece of 19th-century technology that, in 2025, still supplies the drinking water and fire pressure for every building in New York taller than about 6 stories. There are, by the most reliable estimates, somewhere between 10,000 and 17,000 of these tanks on rooftops across the 5 boroughs. Nobody has counted them precisely. The Department of Buildings does not keep a registry. The Department of Health does not maintain a public database. The number that gets cited in the New York Times and the New Yorker and on the Department of Health's own website is a range, not a count, because no agency has ever taken the time to count. Roughly 99% of those tanks are made of wood. Almost all of them are cedar or redwood. The wood comes from forests in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, harvested and milled and cut into staves and shipped across the continent on flatbed trucks. The staves are assembled on Manhattan and Brooklyn roofs by crews from one of 3 family-owned companies. 2 of those companies are based in Brooklyn and 1 is in Long Island City. None of them advertises. None of them needs to. There are roughly 14,000 wooden tanks already on the rooftops of New York, and almost every one of them has come from one of those 3 firms. The tank holds water that has traveled by gravity from a system of reservoirs in the Catskill and Croton watersheds north of the city. The water arrives at the building through a municipal pipe. It enters the basement at a pressure that is sufficient in physical terms to push water up to about the 6th floor of the building and no further. From the 6th floor up, meaning every apartment in every building in New York taller than about 6 stories, the water is lifted by an electric pump from the basement to the rooftop tank, where it sits in storage. Then, when a tenant on the 11th floor turns on a shower or flushes a toilet, the water descends from the rooftop tank by gravity, runs back down through pipes inside the building, and arrives at the tap. The tank is, in other words, the device that makes vertical New York physically possible. Without it, there is no luxury Park Avenue apartment, there is no Midtown office tower, there is no fire sprinkler system that can reach the upper floors of a high-rise. The tank is the reason the city was able to build past 6 stories at all. The tank is also the reason a family in a Bushwick walk-up may, on any given morning, brush their teeth with water that has been sitting for a year above 2 inches of sediment, bird droppings, and bacteria. Both of these things are true at the same time. They have been true since the late 1880s. They will be true tomorrow. To understand how that came to be, you have to walk back to a forest in 1907. Humboldt County, California, the first decade of the 20th century. In those years, the Pacific Lumber Company is clear-cutting old-growth redwood across thousands of acres of Northern California hillside. The company is real. Its records are partially preserved in California's state archives. The trees being cut are 600 to 1,000 years old. They sprouted in the High Middle Ages, while the late Song dynasty was governing China and Edward I was on the English throne. The largest individual trees stand more than 200 feet tall. Picture one of those trees coming down. A logging crew of about 14 men working with double-handled axes and crosscut saws would bring a giant redwood down over 2 or 3 days. This is the documented practice. The specific tree is a stand-in for thousands like it. The trunk would be sectioned into 20-foot lengths and dragged by oxen and steam donkey to a railhead, then loaded onto flat cars, then routed across the country. By the early 1900s, redwood and cedar from these Pacific Northwest and California forests was arriving at lumber yards in New Jersey by the trainload. One of the buyers was a German-Jewish immigrant named Joseph Isaacs, who started a small cooperative business in Brooklyn in 1898. Isaacs Brothers, the company Joseph started, is still in business today, located in Maspeth, Queens, run by his great-grandson. The firm is one of 3. The other 2 are Rosenwach in Brooklyn and American Pipe and Tank in Long Island City, that supply nearly every wooden tank in New York. The price Isaacs paid for redwood in 1908 was a few cents per board foot. The same wood today, when you can get it at all, runs into the dozens of dollars. The old-growth forests that produced this generation of New York water tanks are functionally gone. None of these firms is large. The biggest, Rosenwach, employs about 30 people. Together, the 3 firms have between them fewer than 100 employees. The infrastructure of the city's water system, above the 6th floor, depends on a workforce roughly the size of a single hedge fund's back office. Joseph Isaacs, in 1908, would not have called what he was building a system. He would have called it cooperage. The skill he had brought from Germany, the skill that his father had brought from a village outside Posen in what is now Western Poland, was barrel making. The making of large wooden vessels held together by metal hoops, with no nails, no screws, no glue, just precisely cut staves that swell when wet and seal themselves through pressure. The technique is older than ancient Rome. The Romans called the people who did it couparii. The English word cooper is the same word. What Joseph Isaacs and his contemporaries did between roughly 1885 and 1910 was scale up the cooper's barrel until it was big enough to supply an entire skyscraper. They did it because of the elevator. The Otis safety elevator, patented in 1853 and commercialized in the 1870s, made it physically possible to build buildings taller than 6 stories. By the 1880s, the steel frame construction methods pioneered in Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871 had been imported to New York. By the late 1880s, Manhattan was rising to 7 floors, to 10, to 12, eventually to 20 and 40 and 100. Each new building above 6 stories created a problem the elevators themselves could not solve because Manhattan's water came from upstate, and the upstate water arrived at street level at a pressure that could not get above the 6th floor. You could put a person on the 12th floor of a building. You could not easily put water there. The first generation of New York coopers, Isaacs, Dalton, which became Rosenwach, and a handful of smaller firms now lost to history, solved the problem by hoisting their barrels onto the roofs of the new high-rises. The barrels were filled by steam-driven pumps from below. Once full, gravity did the rest. The water descended from the elevated tank back down through the building's pipes at a pressure of 40 to 60 pounds per square inch, sufficient to drive a shower on the 20th floor or a fire sprinkler system on the 18th. It was a profoundly low-tech solution. It still is. The wooden tank above your apartment in 2025 is engineered the same way the tank above the Flatiron Building was engineered in 1902. The diameter is similar. The capacity is similar. The materials are nearly identical. The only meaningful technical change in 120 years is that the steam-driven pumps in the basement have been replaced by electric ones. Joseph Isaacs, in his Brooklyn workshop in the years before the First World War, would have taken delivery of redwood shipments from Humboldt County and sawed them into staves. Over the course of decades, his firm built thousands of tanks for new buildings going up across Manhattan. Many of those tanks, with periodic replacement of their wood components, are still on the same rooftops today. The redwood that came down in California in 1907 is no longer the wood in any current tank, but the tank's location, its capacity, its design, and the firm that maintains it have in many cases not changed. The forests are gone, the companies are still here. You will not, on most days, look up. The tanks are everywhere in the air above New York, and almost nobody, not the tourists, not most residents, not even most native New Yorkers, pays any attention to them. They are too high to see clearly from the sidewalk. They are too small against a Manhattan skyline to register at any distance. They show up in films and television as a stylized shorthand for New York. The wide establishing shot from above the Empire State Building, the rooftop chase scene, the pigeon-fluttering opening credits. But viewers register them as ambient texture, not as objects. The Edward Hopper painting Roofs of Washington Square, completed in 1926, has water tanks in it. So does Hopper's Manhattan Bridge Loop from 1928. So do dozens of his other New York paintings. Hopper saw them clearly. Hopper saw them as part of the texture of urban loneliness, the empty rooftops, the windowless walls, the human figures isolated in apartment windows. Most of the people who buy Hopper prints today would not be able to identify what they were looking at. The tanks read, in Hopper, as architectural detail. They are infrastructure. There is a reason for the invisibility. The tanks were built to be invisible. The early architects of New York's high-rise era understood that the wooden tank, while functionally essential, was not visually compatible with the architectural ambition of the building beneath it. So the architects hid them. The famous twin-towered apartment buildings on Central Park West, the El Dorado, the Beresford, the San Remo, have ornamental towers rising from their upper floors that look, from the street, like architectural flourishes. They are not. Most of them are housings for water tanks. The decorative tower is the tank cover. Even today, on the most contemporary of New York buildings, the tank is still there. The Freedom Tower at the World Trade Center site has elevated water storage. Rockefeller Center has it. The newest glass and steel residential towers on Billionaires Row have it. Almost every building in New York taller than 6 stories, regardless of its architectural style or completion date, has the wooden barrel on its roof, somewhere, visible or hidden, original or replaced. The function does not change. The wood is still cedar or redwood. The hoops are still steel. The water still flows by gravity. The simplest possible technology on top of the most expensive real estate in the United States. There are gradations. Luxury Manhattan co-ops with active boards and well-funded reserve accounts replace their tanks every 25 years and clean them every 12 months. Small Bushwick walk-ups with absentee landlords and tenants who can't afford to complain sometimes go 30 years without a cleaning. The water in both kinds of tanks comes from the same Catskill watershed, enters the buildings through the same municipal pipes, and is lifted to the same elevation. What happens to it once it reaches the tank is decided by whoever owns the building. Andrew Rosenwach's grandfather Harris, the Polish immigrant who took over the Dalton Barrel Company in 1896, used to tell his sons that there were 2 kinds of customers. Customers who paid for cleanings, and customers who paid for replacements after the cleanings they should have done. The grandsons and great-grandsons say the same thing about the customers their grandfathers sold to 90 years ago. To understand the scale of what these 3 families do, walk into the Rosenwach Tank Company yard in Bedford-Stuyvesant on any weekday morning. The yard is on Stagg Street. It looks from the sidewalk like a small lumber yard, and it is, in part, exactly that. There are stacks of cedar staves under a corrugated steel roof. There are flatbed trucks parked nose out toward the gate. There's an overhead crane. The yard handles, in a typical year, between 300 and 400 tank installations or major rebuilds, about 3,000 cleanings and inspections, roughly 2,000 emergency repairs. The work is done by a permanent staff of about 30 employees and a seasonal crew of subcontractors. The staff includes third-generation coopers, men whose fathers and grandfathers did this work, men whose names appear in Rosenwach Company records going back to the 1960s. The historical record preserves the firm. The individuals are largely unrecorded outside the firm itself. A skilled cooper at Rosenwach can build a complete 8,000-gallon tank from raw staves to functional installation in roughly 20 hours of work spread across 2 days with 2 assistants. The work is dangerous in a specific, unglamorous way. Tank installers spend their days on roofs in all weather. They lift heavy lumber. They carry steel hoops up narrow stairwells when the staves don't fit in the freight elevator. They work at heights of 50 to 400 feet without the safety equipment that would be standard on a commercial construction site because they are operating on existing buildings whose roofs were never engineered for fall arrest systems. 3 Rosenwach employees across the company's 129-year history have died on the job. The family does not advertise this. They do not hide it either. The interior cleaning of an existing tank is the most physically grueling part of the operation. The crew arrives at the building before sunrise. They drain the tank, which takes about an hour. They climb inside through the roof hatch. The interior has fixed steel rungs welded into the wall and descend to the floor of the empty cylinder. They wear waders, headlamps, and respirators. They scrub the interior walls with stiff bristle brushes and a chlorine solution. They shovel the sediment off the floor and carry it up out of the tank in 5-gallon buckets. The sediment is wet, dense, and heavy. A bucket weighs about 40 pounds. A typical tank produces between 4 and 12 buckets of sediment, depending on how long it has been since the previous cleaning. The sediment is, in any tank that has been neglected for more than a year, organic. It contains bird feathers, insect bodies, algae, mineral precipitates, and, occasionally, the remains of small animals that fell through inadequately maintained roof vents and could not climb out. The cleaning crews, when they emerge from a tank that has been neglected for 5 or 10 or 15 years, have stories. They tell some of them, they do not tell others. The Department of Health in 2014 asked the New York Times for help in documenting what the health department itself had not been able to document. The health department's compliance records showed that nearly 60% of New York building owners had failed to file the annually required tank inspection paperwork. The health department, on its own, did not have the inspection capacity to verify how many of those non-filers were actually neglecting their tanks. The Times sent a reporter named Andrew Rice and a photographer to the roofs of 12 buildings across Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn with a sterile sampling kit and a small camera that could be lowered into the tanks on a fishing line. The sampling results, published in the Times in March 2014, showed coliform bacteria in 8 of the 12 tanks, E. coli, an indicator of fecal contamination, in 5 of the 12. The health department's response was that the contamination was concentrated near the bottom of the tanks, while the intake pipes that drew water out of the tanks were positioned mid-tank, above the sediment line. The department's argument was that the water actually delivered to apartments was generally safe even when the tanks were not. Independent water quality experts disputed this. They pointed out that any contamination indicates systemic vulnerability, that intake pipes can become clogged and shift their position, that backwash and turbulence can lift sediment into the upper water column, and that a healthy regulatory regime would not depend on the geometric assumption that the dirt stays where it's supposed to stay. The buildings most likely to be neglected are not generally the luxury co-ops on Park Avenue. They are walk-ups in Bushwick, in East New York, in the South Bronx, in working-class corners of Queens. The tanks above those buildings are, in many cases, 25 or 30 or 40 years old. They supply the water that working-class New Yorkers drink, cook with, and bathe in. The tank above your apartment is the same wooden barrel as the tank above the apartment of a senior partner at Goldman Sachs. The water that arrives at your tap may or may not be. The labor that maintains the system is largely Latino, Caribbean, and second- or third-generation Eastern European Jewish. The crews start at 5:30 in the morning. Some of them work in summer heat that hits 112 degrees on a black tar roof at noon. Some of them work in February ice storms when the tank exterior is sheathed in a quarter-inch of frozen rain and the steel hoops contract and groan in the cold. They make, depending on seniority, between $28 and $52 an hour. They are unionized. Local 14B of the Mason Tenders District Council in the case of Rosenwach, and the union has been the single most consistent advocate for improvements in worker safety on this kind of high-altitude open-air work in the city. The men who do this work are often first-generation American or one generation removed from the boat. Their fathers and grandfathers were the Cooper craftsmen of Brooklyn and the Lower East Side a century ago, the men who scaled up the Cooper's barrel to skyscraper size in the 1880s and 1890s. The trade is generational. A man who starts at Rosenwach at 20 often retires from Rosenwach at 65. His son or his nephew often replaces him. The skill? The way to taper a stave so that it precisely matches the curvature of an 8,000-gallon cylinder, the way to set a steel hoop so that it tightens evenly across the staves as the wood swells, is passed by hand, on the roof, from father to son. The skill cannot be acquired from a textbook. There is no textbook. There is no formal training program. The Department of Buildings does not issue a license for tank installation because there is no license category for it. The trade exists in a regulatory blind spot, a craft so old that the modern apparatus of professional licensure was never extended to it, performed at altitudes and in conditions that no modern industrial safety regime would permit if the work were starting today. It works because it has always worked. It works because 3 families over 4 generations have kept it working. If any of those 3 families decided, tomorrow, to close the business, New York would have a problem the city has no apparatus to solve. The Department of Buildings does not have a roster of qualified replacement firms. The Department of Health does not maintain an emergency response team for tank failures at scale. The system runs on the assumption that the families will keep doing the work because the families have always kept doing the work. In April of 2013, a group of artists and event promoters opened a clandestine bar inside an inactive water tank on the roof of a building in Nomad. The bar was called the Heron. It was accessible only by climbing a ladder up the side of the building, opening an unmarked roof hatch, and descending through the body of the tank to a small floor that the operators had built inside the cylinder. The interior was lined with reclaimed wood, lit by candles and a single Edison bulb, and held about 20 people. The drinks were specialty cocktails. The cover charge was $60. The bar operated for approximately 2 months before the city, alerted by an anonymous tip, shut it down. The Night Heron is the kind of New York story the city tells about itself, the secret rooftop bar inside a piece of 19th-century plumbing, and like most of those stories, it is a moment of visibility for an object that has spent 140 years not being looked at. Photographers, painters, and a handful of art projects have done similar work. The tanks, after a long stretch of being ambient, are being noticed. The visibility makes the tank more recognizable as a piece of New York. It does not make the water in the tank cleaner. The art does what art generally does. The infrastructure does what infrastructure generally does. A Tuesday evening in October 2025, a rooftop on West 57th Street in Manhattan, a new tank is being commissioned. The building behind this scene is a composite Manhattan high-rise, drawn from the typical maintenance cycle of West Side apartment buildings, where the third or fourth replacement of an original 1920s rooftop tank is happening right now, in 2025, on dozens of roofs across the city. Tank crews replace roughly 300 to 400 tanks a year across the 5 boroughs. One of those replacements is being described here. The new tank is cedar, 8,000 gallons, 12 feet tall, 12 feet wide, the same dimensions as the tank it is replacing, the same dimensions as the tank that came before that. The crew finishes the installation at 6 in the evening, the float valve cycles, the basement pumps engage. Water from the Catskill watershed, which has been arriving at this building's basement at a pressure sufficient only to reach the 6th floor, begins to climb the riser pipe inside the building. It rises past the 6th floor. It rises past the 8th, the 10th, the 12th. It enters the new tank from the inlet pipe. The tank begins to fill. Below the tank, on the 11th floor, picture a long-term tenant, a woman in her 70s, the kind of resident who has lived in this apartment since the late 1970s, the kind of resident whose name does not appear in any newspaper or property record, but whose tenancy is statistically common in mid-century rent-stabilized Manhattan buildings. Call her Margaret. She is making dinner. She turns on the kitchen tap to fill a pot for pasta. Water comes out. The water is clear and cold. Margaret, and the thousands of long-term tenants she stands in for, has no idea that the wooden barrel from which her water is currently descending was empty 72 hours ago. She has no idea that the men who installed the new tank are now driving a truck back to a yard in Bedford-Stuyvesant. She has no idea that the wood she is drinking from was cut from a Pacific Northwest forest 2 years ago, milled in Oregon, shipped to a New Jersey lumberyard, finished at a workshop in Brooklyn, hoisted onto her building's roof at 7 this morning, and assembled by a 4-person crew over the course of 12 hours. Margaret has, for decades, lived under wooden barrels she has never thought about. Her neighbors have never thought about them either. Her landlord has, but only in the form of an annual inspection invoice. Her grandchildren, when they visit, have never thought about them. The barrels have always thought about Margaret. The tank above her apartment on the roof of her building on a Tuesday evening in October 2025 holds 8,000 gallons of fresh water that has been processed through more than 100 miles of upstate aqueduct, lifted by an electric pump from her building's basement, and is now descending through pipes in the walls between her kitchen and her bathroom. The water arrives at her tap by gravity, at a pressure of approximately 50 pounds per square inch, sufficient to fill her pot in about 30 seconds. Margaret turns off the tap. She salts the water. She lights the burner. Above her, the tank settles into the slow rhythm that wooden tanks have settled into above New York apartments for 140 years. The float valve waits. The water level falls slightly as Margaret cooks, then again as she does her dishes, then again at 11:15 when she brushes her teeth. By midnight, the level has dropped about 4 inches. The float valve drops with it. The basement pump, sensing the drop, engages with a quiet hum that Margaret cannot hear and lifts another 4 inches of water into the tank. The cycle continues all night. At 3 in the morning, when the city is as quiet as it gets, the tank above Margaret's apartment is full and silent. The wood, freshly swelled with its first water, is settling into its long service life. The cedar that was a tree 3 years ago is now a pressure vessel. The pressure vessel is, in turn, the entire reason that Margaret can live on the 11th floor of a building she could otherwise live in only on the 2nd. The wooden barrel above her apartment is the simplest piece of technology in her building. It is also the most necessary. It will be there, doing exactly what it is doing right now when Margaret is no longer in the apartment beneath it. It was there before her. It will be there after her. The skyline holds, the water rises, the tanks fill. This is what the city is. This is what it has been since the elevator made it possible. A wooden barrel on a roof. 8,000 gallons of water sitting above an apartment. A woman in a kitchen, a pot of pasta on the stove. The system runs.